Good afternoon. My name's Stephen Wheatley. I'm chief exec of a business called Hear Angel Limited. I got into this business a couple of reasons. One, I'm interested in business development, but I've also suffer from hearing loss. I'd also like to introduce my colleague Tony, because he's part of this story. You can see Professor Tony Wright here, who works with us at Hear Angel Limited as our scientific and medical advisor. Tony gave me a hearing test when we first got on with this, and it became clear that I have hearing typical of somebody who's about 15 or 20 years older than I am. I have 8,000 hertz tinnitus, and he surprised me by telling me that I'd used a shotgun quite a lot, and also that I was left-handed. It was like having a hearing test conducted by Sherlock Holmes. It was a bit of a shock. So I understand what it's like to live with hearing impairment. Mine is primarily caused by motorcycling since I was around about 10 years old. After that, quite a bit of Led Zeppelin and quite a lot of shooting. So I suffer quite badly. My hearing is quite a lot older than I am, sadly. And I'm hopefully on a mission to try and help other people avoid the problems that I've got. Okay, so now my screen isn't going to work for some reason. Oh, here we go. Right, okay. So I'm Stephen Wheatley. That's a brief introduction. There's a few credentials there, which Claire has asked me to talk about momentarily. We, Hear Angel Limited, is a contributor to the Senelec Safety Standards Committee, which is responsible for the IEC 62368 safety standards, which is being introduced in December. We're a member of the Hearing Loss and Deafness Alliance. I think there may be some members from that here today. I'm a contributor to the ITU WHO Safety Standards Working Group, which has come out with the safety standards H.870 and 871. I'm also privileged to be a trustee of the UK Hearing Conservation Association, and I'm a member of the WHO's Make Listening Safe campaign committee, and I'm fairly sure there are a couple of members of that committee here also today. So that's a little bit of background. So as well as being interested in this commercially, I'm interested in this from a macro health perspective, in that hearing is my focus and I'm involved where I can be. Claire asked me to say a few words on a couple of these issues. Senelec have issued a new standard 62368 -1 2018, which comes into effect for handsets in December of this year, 2020, and it is being reviewed in the lights of the changes of technology, because at the moment most of the focus is on expecting the handsets to provide protection for recreational headphone users. The issue there is that the handset is becoming less and less relevant as we get more and more wireless headphones. But we're there contributing to that standard. We also contribute to the WHO's much more demanding standard H.870, which for those of you in the recreational industry may be aware that Apple have actually adopted. It's now part of their iOS 13 and above health pack. We're involved in that. That is more demanding, and it does include recommendations for wireless headphones. And then at the bottom, the WHO has a Make Listening Safe campaign, which is focused on increasing the awareness of risk in the high risk group, which is defined as the 12 to 35 years of age group. And we are in the planning stages of a global campaign to make people in those age groups aware of the risks to their hearing so they can conserve it. As I mentioned, I'm joined by Professor Tony Wright, who's the Emeritus Professor of Otolaryngology at the University College London. Don't ask me how long it took me to learn to say that, rather a long time. And I have also, I think it's important when one does a presentation of this sort to disclose the level of interest. So our company, Hear Angel Limited, develops technologies that reduce the risk of hearing damage from reproduced sound in occupation and recreational environments and meet the safety regulations and standards. So we do make a living in this space. and I hope you find these few insights valuable and interesting. So let me just start off on the sort of macro health and safety issue. If we went back 25 or 30 years, I think it's likely that this chap here would not be wearing as much PPE as he is. He might be wearing a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and a baseball cap, and he'd be there grinding something at work. And we can see the effects of health and safety at work in as much as, you know, he's wearing a safety visor, he's wearing a dust mask, he's wearing hearing protection, which some of you will probably quite rightly point out he's wearing incorrectly because they clash with the headgear he's wearing. They should be worn vertically, not horizontally. He's wearing gloves, he's wearing knee pads. We can't see, but my estimate would be he's probably wearing steel toe cap boots. So this is what we're looking at, and we would be horrified if we walked into an industrial environment of any sort and saw somebody doing this sort of task without the right sort of PPE on. There is one other thing here. If I was using an angle grinder on that piece of metal, I'd have strapped it down so it didn't fly off, but hey, that's perhaps just me. So we've made terrific progress in providing PPE to people in lots and lots of different situations. But if we, as we will in a moment, look at the situation in a lot of cases to do with reproduced sound, we're probably 30 years behind. I'll come to that shortly. So we know what we're talking about. Let me just define reproduced sound. Reproduced sound is all the sound that's reproduced electronically by the speakers in headphones or headsets. So you generally are subjected to two sets of sounds. There's those sounds that reach your ears without any form of electronic processing or amplification. Reproduced sound is everything else. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at those in the working environment. And we've divided that into two major categories. The first one is headphones, where they have to be worn for work, as in you cannot do your job unless you're wearing headphones. So to save you worrying about it, I've given some examples. So if we compare this outside broadcast camera operator with our highly protected operative with the angle grinder, we're probably looking at what he would have looked like 20 or 30 years ago. So let me talk you through it. So this particular chap is an outside broadcast camera operator, and he's at some form of sporting event. He's wearing a headset because that's how he communicates with the television program director. So simple question, what is the safe listening period in this situation? That's a question that we must ask ourselves if we're going to protect the hearing of the people we're responsible for correctly. So what is a safe listening period? I'm afraid you can't answer that question without first addressing some other issues. The first one in this case is, what are the ambient noise levels? Now, if he's actually at a horse race track, for example, and he's out on the course somewhere, the ambient noise levels are likely to be quite low. If, however, he's at a Premiership football match, the ambient noise levels are quite high. If he's at a Premiership football match, which is a derby, in my case between perhaps Arsenal and Tottenham, or in Claire's case between Liverpool and Everton, the ambient noise is going to be very high for the whole event. So what is the ambient noise? And that ambient noise is only that noise that would have hit his ear were he not wearing headphones. So we have another measure which we call residual ambient noise. So we've done quite a lot of work with the BBC, who take this problem seriously, and I can assure you this is not a BBC cameraman. The BBC estimate in some Premiership football grounds the noise levels can go to 102 to 104 when there's an incident. And what happens is, at the point there's an incident, that's when the director is instructing the cameraman precisely what he wants them to do. So that's the moment at which the operator has to have the best clarity of conversation with the director. And I suspect what he will have done is he will have turned the feed to his headphones to a very high level. that residual ambient changes throughout a game of Premiership football. But there are other cases. He might well be a cameraman who does Premiership rugby. Some of their grounds are very old, and some of the camera positions are well within the crowd. So you get a much higher level of ambient sound, ambient noise, and therefore much higher levels of residual ambient. So you'd have to do assessments on what this person is receiving frequently throughout the day that or at the period he's working. So because of the residual ambient, he then has to have a listening level, and the listening level is for the reproduced sound. So how loud is he listening to the director? Again, from working with the BBC, they have done measurements on this, and it is between 6 and 10 dB above the residual ambient. So let me just give you a brief example. Let's say that we're at a Premiership football match and the ambient noise is 98 dB. He's getting 6 dB of occlusion from those on-ear headsets. He won't get much more. So what did I say? 98, 92. And then he's having to listen at perhaps 10 dB above that level. So he could be listening to the director at around 102 dB. And the reason it's between 6 and 10 is it depends what you're trying to listen to compared with what is creating the ambient noise. So in a football ground, for example, a rugby ground, the noise is generally created by human voice. So the frequencies are similar to those frequencies you're listening for. So you need more clarity. So his listening level, even optimistically, is going to be in the very high 90 dBs, could easily be in the very low hundreds, at which point he's probably, given the content which we're going to look at, he's probably got somewhere around about 25 to 30 minutes potentially of listening. Is there a risk of transient sound, so splats and feedback and things like that? I don't know whether you know, but a lot of stadia are pre-wired. The broadcasters turn up, plug their cameras and their communication systems into ports which are installed in the stadiums, and they put the truck on the other end of it and they start their broadcasting. In some of the big stadiums, there could be 14 or 20 different locations. Each of those locations has the potential to feed back to some of the others. So yes, he's not totally in control of the sound he's going to experience. He could get a howl round, he could get feedback, he could get a transient. So we need to consider that. So how long is he going to listen? Well, it doesn't sound like very long, does it? I'm going to televise a football match. So you're going to be there for 2 periods of 45 minutes. You might be asked by the broadcaster, you might be required to do some pitch effect stuff beforehand. So probably 2.5, 3 hours possibly on the camera. And we said the listening time could be as little as half an hour, but we don't know. The program material, we do quite well with this on this particular example because the program material is human speech and it is relatively low energy compared with something like electronic dance music. But with all those variables, what is the safe listening period? That's a question that we have to consider, and it's very difficult to come up with a definitive answer. So let's change the game. We're now talking about a sound engineer. And this sound engineer could be in all sorts of different roles. So it could be in an advertising agency, he could be mastering a film score, he could be laying down tracks for a pop record. There are all sorts of things he could be doing. He could be editing a podcast. So he's using his headset and he's listening to program material. But what's the safe listening period? Is there any ambient noise? In this particular example, I don't believe there is, because it looks to me like he's in probably a soundproof studio. So very little ambient noise, and therefore very little residual ambient noise driving up the level in his headphones. But what level is he listening at? We know that sound engineers and monitoring engineers, because they're obsessed with sound, are very meticulous, and they want to listen sometimes at very high levels to try and find out if there's any interference on the track or any artifacts they need to get rid of. But he's completely in control of what level he listens at. So he can listen as loud as he likes, unless we do something to try and protect him. Risk of transient sounds. at day one at sound engineering school, they say when you skip between feeds, you should always put that feed back to 0. I don't know how many of them actually do that. I suspect not very many at all. And it is not uncommon to click from one source to another and find that there is some interference or a howlround on the source you've just clicked to. And that is very, very unpleasant. How long do they listen? Well, this guy could quite easily sit here at his desk, 3 or 4 hours at a time, twice a day, perhaps, depending on the urgency of what he's trying to do. So in this case, the length of time would be very important in trying to calculate what the risks are to this person. Program material, well, if it's speech, if it's a podcast, it's relatively low energy. But what if it's a soundtrack for a film, or he could be editing the soundtrack for a computer game? They're very, very high energy. He could be editing an electronic dance music track, and that is one of the most highly compressed that you can get and would absorb his daily sound allowance, the safe listening exposure, very quickly. So given all those variants, what is the safe listening period? What is it now? We don't know. Another example, a pilot using his headset to communicate with the air traffic control and his crew. What's the safe listening period? Ambient noise? Yes. Many of you may know Dr. Mike Lowe, who's at the ISVR in Southampton, did a lot of work on this, him and his students traveling across the Atlantic in British Airways aircrafts of different types to try and work this out. And yes, there's a lot of ambient noise because it's wind noise on the nose of the aircraft. If it's a rotary wing aircraft, like a helicopter, you've got another problem because some of that ambient noise, while the aircraft doesn't go very quickly, the engine is generally inside a helicopter with you. It's above the pilot's head. So you've got high levels of ambient noise. So what's the residual ambient? The headphones that this pilot are wearing are very similar to the ones that we saw our cameraman wearing. They can probably be expected to reduce the ambient by around about 6 dB. So he can be listening, he's going to get quite a high level residual ambient. Listening level, don't know, but what we do know is it's likely to be 6 or 10 dBs above the background noise. The good news here, it's probably likely to be nearer 6 than 10 because the background noise is wind noise and not coming from humans. So, but we don't know what his listening level is. The risk of transients, we're told by pilots that air traffic control output is not normalized. So when you are in transit, you get handed from one air traffic control sector to another. And when you do so, you quite often find that they're at different levels. Sometimes they're lower levels, others they're much, much higher, and you have to adjust your volume settings. So it may not be a transient, it just might be a very loud radio transmission from the air traffic control. How long do they listen? Well, that's another question. So if you think about a long haul flight, say maybe 6 or 8 hours going somewhere like Las Vegas, you're going to spend a lot of time communicating at the beginning of the flight, and then on the end of the flight. So probably an hour and a half or so at the beginning and similarly at the end. But once you're airborne, you may well have a long period of time when you're just doing operations normal type calls. But if you're doing a short haul flight, I suspect when you take off from somewhere like Stansted to go to Amsterdam, you're probably on your communications all the trip, because as soon as you leave the ground in Stansted, you'll be talking to the air traffic controllers in Amsterdam. And the answer to the question is we just don't know because of the pattern of work. And what's the program material? Well, we're fortunate again, in the main, it's going to be, in fact, it's always going to be speech. What's the safe listening period? We don't know. Something you may all be familiar with is contact center call centers. What's the safe listening period? Low levels of ambient noise relatively because they're working in offices. Residual ambient will be very low. Listening levels could be okay, don't know, but those headsets have their own independent volume control, so the agent can turn it up to whatever they want it to be. Risk of transients, not generally from the equipment, but sometimes from the people they're talking to. We've spoken with people in call centers who've had whistles blown at them down telephones. I don't think I want to ever imagine how painful that could be. So there is a risk, and that should be they should be protected against transients. How long they listen? Could be working 8-hour days working on the headset. Program material, again, relatively low energy content being speech. But what is the safe listening period? We don't know. Finally, the headphones at work. So this is where the headphones aren't actually required to do the job that the person is doing, but they are using headphones at work. And you see this quite commonly. Most commonly is in an open plan office. People are using headphones to isolate themselves or listen to their own content. What's the safe listening period? Ambient noise, relatively low. Residual ambient, probably shouldn't be problematic. Might be, but I don't suspect it will be. Listening level, don't know, because the user is entirely in control of what level they listen at. Risk of transients, probably not, because they're probably listening to something that's coming to them, in this particular case, by Bluetooth. Or they're listening using their phone or an iPad or something like that. So the risk of transients is probably quite small. How long they listen? They could be listening all day. You could get into work and you could theoretically spend your entire day at your desk with a pair of headphones on. Probably more likely you listen half the day. Program material, they might be listening to podcasts, but conversely, they could be listening to electronic dance music. And if they are, they will very, very rapidly use up their sound exposure that is safe. But what is the safe listening period? We don't know. And finally, this is an example. This is an example which has just become much more popular, much more prevalent, is people working from home. And they're working from home and they're using headphones to make calls or listen to their own content. So what is the safe listening period? We don't know. What is the ambient noise? We don't know. It might be quite low if they're at home, but a lot of people are choosing to go out to internet cafes and places like that to get better bandwidth, where they probably do have to wear headphones. So what is residual ambient? We don't know. So therefore, what is the safe listening period? What are the listening levels? Again, they're completely in control of the listening level. So we don't know what that listening level is. Risk of transients? Again, quite small, because they're probably using, in this case, is using a Mac or a phone or something of that nature. But how long do they listen? Conceivably for very long periods of time. Program material, we don't know. We know what they're listening to when they're making phone calls because they're listening to speech. But they could be listening to electronic dance music for 6 hours a day while they're working for you. We need to think about that, and we need to try and work out what is the safe listening period now. So there are other considerations as well. Clearly, we don't have a separate pair of ears that we use when we go to work. And we have one pair of ears which get used in other ways as well. And in London particularly, I don't want to be southeast centric, but we did some work on the London Underground, and people commuting can quite conceivably have used up their sound exposure for a day in 40 or 45 minutes traveling on the tube, listening to music. They then turn up in your business and spend 6 hours in an open plan office listening to headphones again, and then have a repeat dose listening to headphones on their way home. Gaming. I know people who work in environments where they're giving lots of hearing protection, and then they go home and spend 3 hours gaming. Live events, clubbing. I know these aren't directly our issue in terms of protecting the employee, but we need to consider them because they are increasing the risk to the employee. And then there's perhaps a risk to the employer, because if that employee does have hearing damage, I suspect they're going to go to their employer and try and say, I experienced the hearing damage here. We need to address this. So how do we assess these risks, and how can we reliably manage them? It's a vexed question, but I think we're probably perhaps 20 years or so behind the photograph I showed you earlier of the man with all his PPE. The examples that I've given you are all examples that we have come across and do come across frequently. That's the formal part of the presentation complete. Thank you.